Welcome back to Matter of Priorities. I'm your host, Alice Obrecht. This is part 2 of a 2-part episode with Hugo Slim on a set of papers he produced last year with the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies and REACH on redefining the scope of humanitarian need, a topic that is becoming ever more urgent and pressing today in 2025 due to massive funding cuts. In the previous episode, we heard Hugo put forward 3 central questions that he argues that any account of prioritization must answer. Number 1, what is a humanitarian need? Number 2, how wide is the range of goods or services that humanitarian needs cover? And 3, how do we prioritize across needs and populations when funding is scarce? We covered the first 2 questions in the previous episode, and we will begin this episode with Hugo's answer to the third question, followed by some challenges with his account, and finally an updated conversation we held with Hugo in early February after the US cuts were announced.
The first thing I would say, thinking ahead of 2024, is to think of the general principle of shared responsibility and the general principle that some form of selection and prioritization is inevitable in anything you're doing. You're never going to meet all needs. So selection is normal. Selection shouldn't be stigmatized. There's often no way around it. So selection is inevitable. Prioritization is inevitable. And the second thing is this shared responsibility. And I think it's really important for donor governments and for humanitarian agencies and for affected people to understand, and all governments to understand, that there is a division of humanitarian labor. There's no single agency, single financier, single system that can deliver the humanitarian aid that is needed. So we have to accept a moral division of labor, a geographical division of labor, and a sectoral division of labor sometimes. And I'm going to be optimistic about that in 2024, because I'm going to say that geopolitics really helps us now, which people don't usually say at the moment, but I think it does, because we have large parts of the world where there are billions of people which are now, in a sense, governed by much richer, more powerful, more coherent states. So if I look at China, where I'm sitting now actually, and India, and if I look at those areas which have huge numbers of people, those 2 states are really very powerful, really very capable now. And they don't want and they don't need the Western system rushing about. Okay. So the division of labor is, first of all, we realize there are other really big players and we embrace that. And we cooperate and find out how they're organizing their response and their emergencies, and etc. So shared responsibility is key. And then I think if we're going to go down my prioritization list, what else do humanitarians do to make the most of their money? And in brutal terms, who do they count in and who do they leave out as people, as human lives? And I think urgency, which is at the heart of impartiality, the most urgent cases of distress, is still an important one. And we can discriminate on the basis of urgency. And we can look around and say, no, these are the people for whom this is most urgent. And we can prioritize them. I think we should add a third differential there, which is differential suffering. And I think we should start looking closely that, okay, a lot of people will be suffering in climate crisis over the next 10, 20 years. Most people in the world will be suffering. But we can therefore try and say that doesn't mean we have to help everybody, because there's differential suffering. There are certain groups and peoples and places where the suffering is differentially worse because they are suffering more and they are less capable and the systems around them are less capable. So use differential suffering to be really quite hard and rigorous about where you choose to invest. The other big thing that's going to come up, and it's coming up already, because when you realize that we live in a long emergency and that the climate emergency is coming towards us fast, and that requires us recognizing an emergency in the present and also recognizing the future is an emergency. So one of the big priority trade-offs we're going to have, and we're having already, is how much do we invest in protecting and future-proofing communities now, which means investing in nature-based solutions, adapted housing, whatever, and not necessarily rushing around looking for the people in most urgent need, but actually trying to future-proof various communities. I also feel, and I'm very unpopular for this usually, I feel that geographical proximity and social bonds create thicker obligations for humanitarian response. So I think at one level, the impartiality principle in its pure sense is morally unrealistic, because you and I have greater obligations to prioritize our family, our neighbors, the community around us, and everybody in the world has that. And we also have an obligation to prioritize people who are somehow important to us because they are allies, because they are our neighbors, and we are close to them, we can reach them more easily. So I actually think it is morally justifiable to prioritize people who are geographically close to you and emotionally close to you. And that is usually a scandal to hardcore humanitarians. But I think in this day and age, we have to accept that, and people will do it. Governments, I think, have justifiable reasons for doing it, not all the time, but a lot of the time. It doesn't mean they can ignore distant needs if they're unmet, but they can prioritize closer needs. And it's easier to do today because we have other great powers around the world who can do that as well in their region. It might make more sense for China to support people in Pakistan than it does for the EU. And it might make more sense for America to focus on the Philippines than the EU. The other area we're going to have to be quite hard about is feasibility, which always comes into ethics. You can only really be expected to do what's possible to do. So we're going to have to make hard choices around feasible opportunities and say, look, we're going to waste so much money if we just try and do something there. And we could spend that money easily in places where it's much easier to help people. And I'm afraid feasibility counts. It counts always in our lives, in our moral lives. I think it's very difficult for humanitarians to talk about these kind of decisions because we're trained not to.
So, to recap on Hugo's position, humanitarian needs need to be more focused on what he calls vital interests, the issues that are most integral to human survival and a minimally decent life. And prioritization around this means taking a hard and honest look at who is best placed to meet these needs in any given crisis, based on factors that humanitarians are not always inclined to publicly acknowledge, such as geopolitical relationships and proximity. We explored some of the potential challenges and problems with this account, beginning with whether Hugo's simplified Christmas tree, as he put it, is in tension with an approach that places dignity at the center of humanitarian action. My question is getting a bit more into the critical side of these issues. So you've talked about how we need to pull back a bit from this optimizing approach and focus more on life-saving, basic life-saving. One of the reasons or issues that has come up in recent years about why there has been this push for expansion is that generally, and it depends on which stats you point to, but generally it seems that the relevance of humanitarian aid has been dropping. And one of the reasons for this, when you do surveys, when LNAP does surveys, when Ground Truth Solutions does surveys with aid recipients, one of the potential explanations for this is that humanitarian crises are lasting longer. The people who receive humanitarian assistance are more likely to have received it multiple times before or for longer periods of time. And while they appreciate and find that support really relevant for them in the first few months, beyond that, the aid that's being provided starts to lose relevance. And what we hear, particularly from refugees and others who are trapped in prolonged or protracted displacement, is a request for more focus on education, on livelihoods. What we hear from some humanitarian agencies who want to be receptive to this is that humanitarians aren't just about life-saving, it's about preserving and respecting humanitarian dignity, or human dignity, sorry. So is your approach essentially saying we shouldn't care about dignity? That's not the humanitarian job?
No, I like dignity. I'm actually saying, in the sense that if humanitarians focus hard on supporting health needs, social needs, survival capability, and system needs, people will recover their dignity. And humanitarians can't give anybody dignity. You don't bestow dignity on people. People make their own dignity. And what's always striking to any of us who have worked with people who are in extreme suffering and really difficult life conditions is how they do find their dignity in their survival and in the agency they bring to surviving, their people discover their dignity and keep it, not humanitarians, actually. But I think if you do meet those four needs in a supportive, catalytic, creative way, you will enable people to live better. And it probably is quite holistic in your words. And that's why I'm trying not to use the phrase basic needs, actually, because I don't want to go and say these are really basic for two reasons. First, because I think if you meet them, they can create a range of good things in people's lives. But the second reason is, as I say in the paper, it's a bit strange to call them basic needs because often they're very elaborate to actually implement. It's quite difficult doing them well, so they're quite complicated as well as basic. So that's what I was trying to give, is a dashboard that is simpler. And anyone in any moment said, how we focus on enabling health needs to be met, how are we focusing on people's social needs, how are we focusing on supporting them in their survival capability, and are we supporting the right systems for all that? So there's really four things you ever have to ask, in a sense. So I was trying to simplify the framework.
So that was our conversation with Hugo last year. He kindly gave us his time again in recent weeks to reflect on the aid cuts facing the sector and what this means for some of his proposals and ideas on defining new boundaries for humanitarian aid. Here's Hugo again. Great. Thank you so much, Hugo, for taking the time to chat with us again at this very difficult time for the sector right now, where I think the ideas we talked about from your papers last year are more important than ever before. I think one of the many things that people are really trying to contend with right now, amongst job losses, amongst having to relocate families across the globe at the last minute, are, of course, the very practical, important, and painful decisions on where to be cutting in their budgets, with many organizations looking at making cuts to 40%, 50%, 80% of their programming and their work. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of things that factor into those decisions, including where they think are most likely the places where other donors and funders might be able to step in to fill gaps. But just reflecting from an ethical perspective, based on the work you did last year and your entire career in the sector, what considerations do you think are useful for people to be bearing in mind as they make these difficult cuts?
Well, it is very hard, as you say, Alice. And, it's interesting watching, Trump, Rubio, and Musk crash the international aid system. And, they've chosen to do it. They've chosen to do it in this way. Usually when Musk or Trump sacks lots of people from his company or, crashes a company or changes it or buys it, people have terrible times. They lose their jobs and things. But in this case, they are bringing about the death and suffering of many, many people around the world, as well as that personal family disruption to their employees. So it is a huge shock to the system. I haven't got great words of consolation to say. The only thing I would say, as I've been thinking about it, is that, of course, this international aid system, USAID, was really invented after the Second World War. It was invented, development aid, humanitarian aid was sort of invented and consolidated after World War II in US and international policy. USAID was established, I think, in 1967. So things are invented and then things go. And I think we've got to be used to that. I think it happens in a lot of people's lives. We will have to do a couple of things, I think. First of all, we're going to have to try and make the best of the crash. So people are going to have to try and patch things up as much as they can. And that will involve prioritizing, basically around the most urgent cases of distress. So I would have thought life and death, medical situations, extreme, nutritional feeding things. I think a lot of the other things that humanitarians have been doing was often about managing chronic poverty anyway, not about life and death situations. So I think a lot of those will have to fall away at this point. And humanitarians will have to be hardcore humanitarians again, I think. And then secondly, going forward, we'll see if the State Department comes up with a much smaller, well, it will come up with a much smaller staff. And let's hope it comes up with a humanitarian aid program of some kind. I said I think it's probably, this is going to be a very conservative government. So I think at best that new conservative humanitarian program will be sort of Samaritan's Purse writ large. It'll be those kind of agencies, that kind of very sort of urgent relief response. I think those liberal agencies, will be punished, like IRC and the Oxfams, and people that are considered having a woke agenda at their heart. And I don't think they'll bounce back. I expect IRC will shrink. I expect some of other, big US NGOs will shrink. I think we're probably going to have more of a faith-based edge to humanitarianism going forward from the United States. And I think the fact that the new American approach is going to very deliberately trim down bureaucracy. So if they're serious, they're going to have 200 or 300 people running the new US aid. It won't be called that. It'll be called something else in the State Department. I think they will expect that to happen throughout the sector. So I think one of the big ripple effects of this aid crash will be a de-bureaucratizing of the sector. So I think a lot of people who feel they're not touched by it yet, sitting in Geneva, New York, various capitals, in regional posts, they will be, because I think the new understanding of aid will be that it has a low admin and high output ratio. And I'm afraid, in truth, we have gone the other way lately. So some of the American analysis is right. So I think we're going to have to patch as best as we can for the moment, because I don't think European donors will go on funding it either. And remember, they started cuts before the Americans. So this is not an American phenomenon. I mean, I think the sort of dreadful way it was, that very macho way it was crashed by Musk and Rubio and Trump is very American, but it's been happening for the last couple of years.
Thank you. On the point on bureaucracy and admin, I mean, you've been working, Hugo, in the sector since the 90s. You were working as an aid worker in the 90s in country. And so you'll know that, not to make a defense of bureaucracy, but the reason for a lot of that bureaucratization over the years, one is through donor requirements, like from donor agencies such as USAID that required more compliance, more paperwork, but also because there were very big perceived missteps by the humanitarian aid sector in the response to the Rwandan genocide, of course, in the 90s, responses to Darfur and to the East Asian tsunami in 2005, which is now we're reaching the 20-year anniversary of that. But all of those big-scale humanitarian responses seem to highlight the quality issues, the performance issues of having a sector that really focused on kind of quite basic core humanitarianism and didn't pay enough attention to wider impacts of its aid, didn't pay attention to wider issues of quality and kind of the additional administrative costs it takes to deliver that. So what would you say to how we can avoid just turning back the dial and going back to the system we had in the 90s?
Yeah, you're very kind, Alice, because I actually started in the 80s. So I actually started in 1983, bizarrely. Anyway, I take your point that, we need institutions. We need good humanitarian institutions. And therefore, we have to find a balance between bureaucracy and professionalism. And I think I take your point that a lot of the sort of extra layers to humanitarian administration have come from donors and their obsession on compliance and M&E and goodness knows what. It's also come from good ethical aspirations of humanitarians to do better quality programming with standards, and also to, reduce their own terrible failures in sexual abuse and things like this. So there's a lot of it that's there for the right reasons. But if I'm honest, there's also a lot of what the American anthropologist, whose name I've forgotten, calls bullshit jobs. There's a lot of bullshit jobs in humanitarian organizations. I've sat in meetings where I'm thinking, what the hell are we all doing? And why are we just talking to ourselves and feeding our own processes? And what on earth has that person been hired for? It's a sort of non-issue, and just because IRC have got one of those teams, we've got to have one now, or whatever. So I think there are bullshit jobs that can go. And I think what we should focus on is having institutions, because the good thing about institutions is that they hold and develop values. And we want the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, UNICEF, World Food Programme, Save the Children, all these things. We want these values in international society, and they are best vested in good institutions which represent them, speak up for them, and act on them, and encourage states to act on them. But I think we can do that much leaner. I do think we can go to hundreds rather than thousands in most capitals and institutions and things like that. There's a lot of jobs that don't need to be done, and there's as you know, an old phrase, Parkinson's law, from a very early British civil servant who was observing the expansion of the British Foreign Office, actually. And he noticed it had become at its biggest at the moment when the empire was at its smallest. And this is often what happens, because you recruit more and more, and then that team needs to recruit to keep a balance with your team and whatever. So, yeah, let's get rid of the bullshit jobs, and let's focus on professionalism, quality, and getting more output than input.
So definitely a leaner humanitarianism to come. I think another feature of Secretary Rubio's approach to humanitarianism and the Trump administration's approach to humanitarianism is going to be much more political, for sure, much more regional. And this came up in our conversation last year from your papers, where you were discussing that this might be an important aspect of prioritization that you see from the donor state perspective, that they start to step up and prioritize their humanitarian spending based on their existing regional ties or existing political relationships with other states. So, for example, Saudi Arabia should be doing more to fund and address humanitarian crises in its region than, say, the US or Europe. It seems very likely we will be moving to that type of model. But obviously the competing concern there is that we're losing, this is the end or the death of the concept of humanitarian aid as a universal value that reflects shared humanity around the globe, and instead becomes another tool in the foreign policy toolkit. So what is your thought on that, of this, what everyone's expecting to be a much more nationalistic approach to humanitarian, state-based humanitarian aid, if it does continue to survive? Does that explicit tying of humanitarian aid to foreign policy interests undermine the universality of humanitarianism? And what does humanitarianism even really mean as a value in that geopolitical context?
Yeah, well, I think we need a middle way here too, because I want national humanitarian aid. I mean, I think one of the advantages we've got from this crash is that when we build leaner, I hope that'll be because we're building more national, more local than we are international. So I think localization, nationalization of humanitarian capacity has got to be one of the ways to go forward. And I hope the remaining humanitarian investors like the UK, EU, Europe, others, Scandinavians, will find value for money and better professionalism in national and locally led organizations. I don't agree that taking your closest responsibilities seriously means that you stop being universal and stop having a universal value. I mean, you can just become a ghastly nationalist government, and there's a high risk that President Trump's government's going to be just that, persecuting and punishing its enemies inside the country and outside the country, and not really respecting universalism in any way, and replacing it with commercialism. I think that's a serious likelihood, actually. But it needn't be that. I mean, Saudi Arabia should be investing more in its region. It's more strategic to it. It has closer proximity in terms of kinship and language and relationships and geography and shared interest. So it does have a primary obligation there, despite universalism. It's also in a position where it can fund all around the world because it is so rich. But I think I wouldn't object if European aid is focusing mainly on Europe, but also trying to be universal at times and step into other regional emergencies and support African response. But we are going to have more and more climate emergencies too. So we are going to have more genuine primary obligations on humanitarian budgets for our own people, as the British government, the German government, the Ethiopian government, the Saudi government, Indian government, Chinese government. So I think we must go to a system of systems. We must recognize that, China has a sphere of influence in humanitarian aid. So does Europe, so does Africa, so does the rich Gulf countries, etc. But to ensure universalism, we need to pull those systems together into universal values into universal, global systems of humanitarian planning, response, whatever. And that's something that the UN should be doing and should be able to do as part of the new multilateralism. I mean, we really need to make a new multilateralism. And I think a universal system of systems on humanitarian response would do that, pulling states together. But I think we do have particular obligations to people closer to us that can trump distant obligations. I'm just that kind of ethicist, I'm afraid.
And that builds into my next question about how we kind of reframe or maybe even resell the value of humanitarianism in the modern era, because what has been a constant feature of the dismantling of U.S. aid over here in the U.S. And amongst the public is the widespread kind of public, I would say widespread, but very loud, vocal public dissent with foreign aid and kind of anti-aid sentiments, feeling that it is this, reflecting very much some of the ideas that you're articulating, but in very different ways, that it is about serving and addressing the needs of fellow Americans, fellow compatriots first. And that's not limited to the U.S. We've seen this kind of right-wing populist turn, which has supported nationalist governments that have been elected across Europe over the past 2 years. So in that climate, and you mentioned a few minutes ago how the modern humanitarian era was really born out of the post-World War II consensus. We've seemed to be definitely losing that now, moving away from that post-World War II consensus. So how do we defend a moral commitment to humanitarianism and really treating or viewing all people as equal when it seems to be under consistent attack and is being eroded in public values in many Western countries, for sure?
Well, that's difficult, isn't it? And I think we're going to have to go and have proper discussions with people. I mean, there'll be no choice. Humanitarian organizations in Germany, depending on what happens on the 23rd of February, will have to go and talk to all sorts of different parties. So they're going to have to reach a new consensus. And let's see what it is. And, if they are all fascists and they just want to focus on their group, their ethne, then we'll learn that and we'll have to become all subversive and, rebellious and risk imprisonment and things for arguing other things. And that it could go that way. But if not, I think we're going to have to come to a new consensus and find a new balance, which recognizes what I said earlier, that we're going to have greater humanitarian needs in our own countries, in Europe and other rich countries. I mean, looking at the predictions for water and heat in the what's called the Middle East, I don't think they've got much hope over the next 20, 30 years. So I think they're going to have big trouble as well. They're going to either be spending like crazy to survive or buying new countries to go and live in. So it's going to be a massive new consensus. And I think, although it's been done, the crash has been done by America for sort of budgetary and sort of macho, anti-woke and bureaucracy reasons, in fact, it does give us an opportunity to design a new system for the climate emergency. Let's hope that slowly builds. But it won't be quick. And a lot of people will just leave the sector because they have to, and we'll have to work out what it is, this sector, and what it means in the 2020s and 2030s.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, Hugo. It's very helpful to get a bird's eye view, as usual, and get a bigger perspective on these issues that feel so existential and so practical and present. So thank you very much. We appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to A Matter of Priorities, a podcast by ALNAP. For resources and links related to what we've talked about in today's episode, please check out the description. For more information on ALNAP, please visit our website, www.alnap.org. And if you enjoyed this episode, please hit subscribe to our series wherever you get your podcasts.